Now welcome to Making a Viking Sword Part 4. I apologize for the delay in the videos. We're going to get back into our unwrap editor here. Now with the vertex selection, we hit select element. We're just going to drag a little box around the bottom half of the blades. That'll select everybody. Now I hold Control and grab one of the top corners and drag these down. What we're going to do is manually fit everybody into our box here. Now again, with these things, the more detail you want, the more real estate inside the box you want the thing to take up. Unfortunately with these, with the blades, they have to fit, so they're going to end up rather small. Older versions of Macs allowed you to change the dimensions of the box, and you could still actually see it correctly. If you applied a checkerboard to it, you could still see it. I'll go over that in a second. After, I think, Mac 6, they changed it. I know in Mac 7 it was changed, and they basically just broke it. Max 4.2, 3D Studio Max 4.2 worked perfectly when you changed the dimensions from square to rectangle, and none of the others pretty much did. We're going to go ahead and apply. Drag this out a little bit for a second here. We're going to apply the checker pattern so you can see the checker look inside here. This will give you an idea of how they appear. You'll note that some of these are stretched and distorted. That's the handle here. It looks too... The boxes are really long and thin. Hold Shift, scale it, and that'll allow you to scale in one direction or the other. Oops. I'm going to hit Control Z and undo that. Oh, that's right. Because it's tapered and we kept it a straight cylinder, we're going to have a bit of distortion on there. Again, none of these are overlapping. This is just in case anyone who wants to use baked-in lighting effects or anything like that, you can. I'm not going to go over those in this video. I don't ever use them, so I generally tend to ignore them. I can go over them in a separate video though. Again, every time I'm going to scale these, I'm holding Control so it scales it uniformly. Let's bring these up out of the way for a moment. And scale this down some. Put these guys into here and then scale them back up. The handle down here. The handle's just going to have a real basic wood texture on it for this, so it doesn't have to be real huge. If you want to do a high detail wire wrapping or something like that, it'll have to take up about a third of the real estate. Normally what I do with these is I'll try to save enough room out to put a scabbard in here. Right now we're just going over the sword itself, so try to get a little more room for these two. Alright, that should suffice. Now we hit Tools, Render UVW Template. For the, by default it's usually 1024 by 1024, again unless you've made a custom size. Let me go over the custom size real quick here, just so you can see what happens. Display if I can find it. Preferences. What we have, this is what the size is here, 256 by 256. Once you have a texture on it and you're looking at it in here, it's going to look really small and pixelated. Don't worry, that your end result won't be reflected by that. See, we leave the 256. Let's put the height at 1024. So that's 4 times the size. Tell it OK. And we're going to close this. Notice it's squished. And we notice that the checkerboard gets squished along with it, yet it still looks normal here. What you have to do in versions after Max 4.2 is take all of these guys, hold Shift. Since we're close to the edge, we know we can take it close to the edge of this one. And there's double, but it's still not quite there. You hold Shift, drag the whole thing over to this edge, holding Shift again, and this ends up being quite a convoluted mess. You have to again drag it out 1 more quarter and then rescale everything to fit in here. I'm not a big fan of having to do that. I've had to on several items, but I'm going to go back to preferences, change this to 256 by 256. Okay, I will just leave it at that for this case. Tools, Render UVW Template. You can run 2048 by 2048 if you need to for higher detail. I'm going to bring up, it gives us our render map here. This should look like dotted lines on the screen. If we zoom in, it's all there. It just looks bad once it's scaled down. Hit your the little disk icon in the corner for save. UVW. At the end, you can pick save as file type, or just leave it on all formats and hit .jpg and then enter twice. You can close this, right mouse click, and collapse to. We're going to minimize that. We'll close this. No. File open. And then we go to our documents, 3ds Max, scenes, that's where it saved it by default. You can save it anywhere you want. Viking 08 UVW.jpg and open. Now we have a regular locked JPEG. Remove tool. We double click where it says background image over here. Double click that, ask for layer 0 and tell it OK. Now it is an unlocked layer. Then we change our blending mode to screen. Now we have it's free floating. The advantage to saving it this way as opposed to like PNG or something like that, which will only render out the wireframe, is if we accidentally move this, we can just very quickly take it and snap it back up into the corners. So let's get this actually into screen. We hit Control Shift N, for a new layer. We'll call that steel. And I'm going to hit D on the keyboard to reset my color palette. And Alt Delete. It makes a solid black. One of the reasons we're starting out with the dark color, I'm going to hit Control U and bring the lightness up a little bit. Usually about 12. We start out with a dark color because silver pretty much is black. We polish it up and smudge it about until it reflects light, shiny like a bright gray. Now the key with this is doing everything in its own layers. So I'm going to make a selection around all of the stuff that encompasses the cross guard. Hit Control Shift N for another new layer. Call that gold. And we'll pick ourselves, actually we don't even have to. The easier way is Alt Delete, Control D, deselect, Control U to bring up our colors again. We're going to hit Colorize. For the hue, 36, saturation, 36, then our lightness until it kind of looks like gold, usually about 40. Again, it's still darker than gold, paler, but when you add in your specular map, that's what's going to cause it to really pop out. Now for the handle, we're going to cheat. Instead of fabricating a brand new texture, we'll open one up. I have my texture library of textures I've made over the decade. It's sitting open on the left side there. You hit V on the keyboard for the move tool to get off our selection tool. Control A, Control C for select all and copy, then Control W. That closes it. We don't need it anymore. We come back to our steel layer. Control V. That pastes it in. Control T. That gives us our free transform, and what we want to do is get it just barely outside of our handle. Hit enter twice. Usually hitting enter once works fine, but twice guarantees it. And that's good enough for now. Now, if we hide our top layer, hit fit on screen. Oops. Hit fit on screen. There we go. Control S for save. Now what I'm going to do is take off the UVW. Click off, save it as a PSD with its layers intact. Come here and hit M. The letter M is in mom. And I'll leave it on the first shader ball there. Don't need to, for what we're doing, since these are getting imported into games, you really don't need to mess with any of this. There's plenty of videos that go over what every little detail does in here, and we don't need to even be messing with it. Hit Maps. On diffuse color, select none, then at bitmap, double click bitmap, and go to where you saved that. In 08, make sure you select the PSD file. It'll say collapse layers, yes. That'll show you everything. Then you can hit, I don't know if that box highlights with the software, the assign material, and then your little blue and white checkerboard cube, turn that on, that'll show it to you in here. You'll notice it looks really bad pixelated. Again, it's rendering it out as a 256, but it is there. F9, the hotkey for render, is also the hotkey to pause the video. How awesome is that? I'll be right back. I'm going to see if I can change the settings. I'll figure it out later. Okay, I'm back. Well, I guess for now we'll just suffer with this. I could turn it up, but it's pointless at this time. We're just going to go for trying to get ourselves a decent texture set up. Now, one of the things you'll get a lot of people who don't have a lot of actual game development industry experience, they'll tell you, you drag in the texture library here, they'll tell you you can take this texture and just drag it from here right directly onto a shader ball like this. So, and that's fine, it's a nice fast way of doing that. But when you edit this texture, it does not ever automatically update in here. You have to manually tell it to reload. So it's just kind of a bad idea. Yes, it's fast initially. It's much better to follow the right paths, which is assigning it via the bitmap path. We can hit M again and close that and go back into Photoshop. Now, one of the things I'm going to do here is a magic wand tool. This is a very quick and dirty way of doing it, but it works. I'm going to hit the magic wand in the open area of just our unwrap window. Since this isn't a whole lot of stuff on here, I'm going after the blade right now. We have contiguous on, and we can click here and it will select everything within the lines. If you have contiguous off, it'll select everything of that color. It's a good way if you want to grab out your wireframe. You can do that and hit Control-Shift-I and invert your selection, and then you'll have just a wireframe. So we hit contiguous, copy, paste, Control-C, Control-V. Now this gives us a new layer. What I want is to select inside each of the blades, Control-Shift-N, another new layer, highlights. We're going to grab the polygonal lasso tool. You can also use the marquee tool. We're going to flip these colors, which you can either use this or hit X. Now inside the selection, we hit stroke. 6 pixels, center. That centers it along the dotted line. You'll have 3 pixels on each side. It looks like it's probably going to be good enough. All we're doing is building kind of a polish highlight. Filter, blur, blur more, or blur, and then Control F. And what that's going to do is you can fine tune it. If it's taking too long, try blur more, and you can keep pounding on it. And if that takes too long, you can hit filter, Gaussian blur, and then 3, 4. 5 looks good. Tell it OK. Now we're going to deselect by Control D, hit filter, blur, then go back to blur more. And the reason why is we don't want that hard edge of the selection. Control F a few more times, and that's going to give us our shiny highlight. Next thing we do is the same kind of highlight, only reversed for this part. Right click, stroke. This time we're going to do 3 pixels. I'm going to do it outside. So so it's on the outside. Control Shift I inverts the selection, so now it's on the interior. Blur more. Since it's a thinner line, it's going to blur easier. Deselect. 2. Select all, Control A. Hit V for your move tool. Hold down. This is a fun one. Hold down Alt and Shift at the same time, then click and drag. Whoops. I didn't make it on 2 layers. Wonderful. I'm going to take the rectangular marquee tool. Ignore this down here, that'll go away. Control X cuts that part out. Hit V after dragging a box around it. And then using that method of Alt and Shift, you can drag it. It makes a copy on the same layer if it's selected. I'm going to hit Control D and deselect this. If you don't have a selection and you use Alt and Shift, it makes a copy of the layer, which is very handy, especially if you have to do extra manipulations. So what we want to do, take this layer 2, right mouse click and delete layer, drag the highlights down underneath the wireframe, turn everybody else back on, turn the wireframe off, Control S save. Yes, this looks very cheesy, it's just basics for now, and I can't hit render because F9 is pause. Again, you're seeing a very low budget version here that doesn't actually reflect it. You can change this in your preferences. You'll note that I have the undo level set to its max of 500. Let's see if we can find it. And off that goes. I did not see it in there. Alright. This is just giving us our basics. I'll go over custom brushes in Photoshop for getting a better design for this later in a different video. And we're going to want to do this one more time. I probably should have done the gold highlights at the same time. Copy, paste, Control C and Control V. I'm going to select go back to the lasso tool so we can do a stroke. Again, center, mouse wheel that up back to 6. Filter. I'm going to go Gaussian blur, but only do it 3. Tell it OK. Control D, deselect. Filter, blur, blur more, and then hit Control F to reapply that a couple of times. Now, oops, you know what? We're going to undo all of that. Control Alt Z. Control Shift N. Sorry. Highlights 2. This can be merged down into highlights later. Going to delete that. Now we will add the stroke. Filter, blur, Gaussian 3, Control D for deselect, and then filter, blur more. One of the things we'll need to do, this will put a big white seam right down your edges of the of the handle. So I'm going to take a brush for the eraser. It's a soft brush, one of the feathered edges here. You can use your bracket tool to make it larger or smaller. If you set your flow to 60, it will give a nice soft erase feathered edge, and you can blend it in very well with what's existing, well, with what needs to stay. Again, these are real quick and dirty. These are very simple. I'm not going to go into any really advanced methods for building the textures on this yet. One of the things we want to do here is get rid of this whole thing. So I'm going to erase out just little bits, and we're going to take a selection tool, make sure our feather's on 0. Go around this, Control X, go back to our brush, give ourselves a break line that's nice and feathered in, and again make a selection around the bottom. I don't think this video capture actually records any of the mouse movements or the details of the selections, which I apologize for. Control X. Back to fit on screen. Now the reason we did this one in its own separate layer, and drag it underneath the wireframe, is I'm going to hit V, and now we're going to lower the opacity, which is over here, but we don't need to bother with that bar. If you're on like the move tool, which is V for victory by default, let's hit 6, it automatically changes it to 60, which looks like it'll be good for this. 36 is about where you'd want something like this for an actual highlight. Same with this on the blade. You don't want it any brighter than that. We're going to hit Control S to save that out. Now Control Shift S, and this we're going to put an underscore S, and that'll be our specular map. Highlights, both back up to 100, which is if you just hit 0 once. The wood, Control U, and we just want it to look like dead wood for this case, so it's down all the way. Control S, hit save. Now let's hit M again, and let's see if you can make that flash. You can bring up your material navigator here, back your hierarchy. We hit 0, 1 default. That brings us back to the map selection. And we're going to hit specular level, not specular color. Hit none, double click bitmap, and it will have whatever you loaded last. Shift dash underscore and look for the S. Open, tell it OK, and you'll notice immediately the contrasts on your shader ball, and that will affect this. If you hit F9 in here, you'll be able to see where it's starting to shine. Now we want to have some silver contrasts. Let's just do this real simply. Actually, we're going to close that one without saving. File, Viking 08. Back to here. Control Shift N. So LVER for. We're going to make ourselves a silver layer. Hit D on the keyboard. And for this, it's just going to be strips. Alt delete. You can use any pattern you want. I've done all sorts of them. Control U for our lightness. Again, we're going to bring this back up to 12. Hit V. You want it to overlap so it's solid all the way across. If I hold down Alt and Shift, I can make duplicates of this. Now I hit Control A, select all of them. Alt and Shift again. Select all, Alt and Shift again. That's enough to production me through it. Control X, drag a box around, kill what you don't need. Turn on the screen. Control S for save. Now we're going to open up. Probably should have done that beforehand. Usually I completely build out the texture first, the diffuse first. I have 50, 60, 200 layers, whatever, on here of everything. Every shadow, every highlight, all set up. Then I will save that out as a normal map and a specular map, and it only takes a few seconds to a couple of minutes to build your normal and specular off of that, as opposed to spending 30 plus hours mucking about in a training wheel program like ZBrush or Mudbox, where you're trying to get the specular map and normal map looking good, and basically you end up with something that looks like it's been smeared with Vaseline. In this case, it works, it's dead on accurate, and the NVIDIA tools are just fine for something like this. Alright, we want to replace this file, so we're going to turn on highlights back up to 0 for 100. Silver, we're changing that, the lightness up. 76 is good. Again, the wood, Control U, all the way off. Control Shift S, and we're going to do our underscore opacity, or not opacity, specular. So we overwrite that, yes. Damn it! And I forgot my computer swears at me. Sorry about that. Okay, now if you hit F9, you'll where is it? Ah, there we go. These will, even though they look dark here, they'll shine pretty brightly. Alright, I'm going to go ahead and call it on the texturing. I know this is really primitive and really ugly. I'll bring up, I'll do one other video on doing alternate textures and designs for these, and bring up some of the textures that I've done for various Viking swords like the Ulfbert and the Heartbiter. Alrighty, take it easy guys.